In the final years of World War II, as the conflict reached its most decisive phase, there existed a German communication system so secure, so complex, that even the most brilliant Allied codebreakers feared it might be truly unbreakable. This was not the famous Enigma machine, the one often associated with Nazi encryption. No, this was something far more sophisticated, far more dangerous. It was the Lorenz Cipher. Unlike Enigma, which was widely used across German military units, the Lorenz system operated in the shadows of the highest command. It was reserved for Hitler himself and his top generals, men who directed entire armies, coordinated massive offensives, and shaped the course of the war from behind closed doors. These messages were not routine battlefield orders. They were strategic blueprints, transmitted between Berlin and the front lines, carrying decisions that could determine the fate of nations. The Lorenz cipher worked in a completely different way from Enigma. While Enigma relied on a system of rotating mechanical rotors, Lorenz was designed for teleprinter communication, using a far more advanced method of encryption based on complex patterns of electrical impulses. It didn't just scramble letters, it transformed entire streams of data into something that appeared completely random. To anyone intercepting the signal, it looked like meaningless noise. And that was exactly the point. German leadership believed Lorenz was flawless. They trusted it completely. In their view, it was mathematically secure, far beyond the reach of enemy intelligence. Unlike Enigma, which required human operators to configure daily settings, Lorenz operated with a level of complexity that made brute force attempts practically impossible. The sheer number of possible configurations was astronomical. Breaking it by hand would take not days, not months, but lifetimes. This confidence shaped how the Germans used it. Sensitive discussions, plans for troop movements, supply coordination, even high-level strategic intentions were sent freely through Lorenz transmissions. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing. Why would there be? From their perspective, no one was listening. But they were. Across the English countryside, in a quiet, unassuming estate known as Bletchley Park, a secret war was unfolding. Hidden behind layers of secrecy, a small group of mathematicians, linguists, engineers, and analysts worked tirelessly to intercept and decode German communications. They had already made progress against Enigma, slowly peeling back its layers, but Lorenz was something else entirely. When the first Lorenz transmissions were intercepted, they baffled everyone. The signals were longer, more structured, yet completely unreadable. Traditional methods failed instantly. Frequency analysis? Useless. Pattern recognition? Nothing. It was as if the Germans had created a system that erased every trace of language itself. For the codebreakers at Bletchley Park, this wasn't just another puzzle, it was a wall. And behind that wall lay the thoughts of Hitler's inner circle. The stakes could not have been higher. By 1943 and 1944, the war had reached a critical turning point. The Allies were planning massive operations, none more important than the eventual invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe. To succeed, they needed intelligence. Not guesses, not estimates, but precise, reliable information about German strategy. Without access to Lorenz, they were effectively blind at the highest level of the enemy command. Imagine trying to outmaneuver an opponent when you can only see their lowest level moves, but not the decisions being made at the top. You might win small battles, but the larger strategy would remain hidden. That was the situation the Allies faced. They could intercept messages, yes, but they could not understand the most important ones. Every day that passed without breaking Lorenz was a day the Germans retained their advantage. And yet, there was one moment, almost accidental, that would change everything. A mistake.
Somewhere within the German communication network, an operator made a critical error. A message was sent, then resent, but not exactly the same way. It was a small slip, the kind that might go unnoticed in the chaos of war, but for the analysts at Bletchley Park, it was a crack in the armor. By comparing the two transmissions, they began to glimpse the structure hidden beneath the chaos. Patterns emerged, not clearly, not completely, but enough to suggest that Lorenz was not invincible after all. It was a breakthrough, but also a realization. Even with this advantage, solving Lorenz by hand would be an overwhelming task. The complexity was simply too great. Human effort alone would not be enough. They needed something faster, something more powerful, something that didn't yet exist. The problem was no longer just about code breaking. It had become an engineering challenge. How do you build a machine capable of processing thousands of possibilities in seconds? How do you design a system that can analyze encrypted data at a speed no human could match? And perhaps most importantly, how do you do it in the middle of a world war, under constant pressure, with no guarantee it will even work? As the team at Bletchley Park wrestled with these questions, the clock was ticking. German commanders continued to send their most sensitive communications through Lorenz, completely unaware that their unbreakable cipher was under attack. Every message carried secrets, secrets that could save lives or cost them, secrets that could determine the success or failure of entire operations. The Allies knew what was at stake. If they could break Lorenz, they wouldn't just gain intelligence, they would gain direct insight into the enemy's highest-level thinking. They would know what decisions were being made before those decisions reached the battlefield. It would be like seeing the future unfold in real time. But if they failed, that advantage would remain forever out of reach. And so, in the quiet rooms of Bletchley Park, a new kind of war began to take shape, not one fought with guns or tanks, but with logic, mathematics, and the relentless pursuit of a hidden truth. The Lorenz cipher was not just another code, it was the gateway to Hitler's secrets, and breaking it would require a machine unlike anything the world had ever seen. By the time the first cracks in the Lorenz system began to appear, the atmosphere at Bletchley Park had already transformed into something intense, almost electric. This was no longer just a place of quiet analysis. It had become the front line of an invisible war, where every intercepted signal carried the weight of thousands of lives. The people working here were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They were mathematicians, linguists, chess champions, engineers, individuals pulled from completely different worlds and placed into one of the most secretive operations of the war. Among them was a relatively unknown but brilliant engineer named Tommy Flowers, whose ideas would soon challenge everything others believed was possible. At first, however, even the best minds at Bletchley Park struggled to make sense of Lorenz. The breakthrough caused by the German operator's mistake had revealed glimpses of structure, but turning that into a working solution was another matter entirely. The cipher was still overwhelmingly complex. It was like discovering a few pieces of a massive puzzle without knowing what the final image looked like. To make progress, the codebreakers had to reconstruct the logic behind the machine they had never seen. They gave it a name, Tunny. No one at Bletchley Park had ever laid eyes on the actual Lorenz machine. Everything they knew came from intercepted signals and careful deduction. They began mapping patterns, identifying repetitions, and slowly building a theoretical model of how the cipher might function. It was painstaking work, hours of concentration for even the smallest insight. And time was not on their side. By 1944, Allied commanders were preparing for one of the most ambitious operations in history, the invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe. The success of that operation depended on knowing how German forces would respond. Where were their reserves? How quickly could they move? What did their leadership expect? The answers to those questions were locked inside Lorenz transmissions. Without them, the Allies were making critical decisions with incomplete information, and in war, incomplete information can be deadly. The pressure at Bletchley Park grew heavier with each passing day. Long hours turned into longer nights. Teams worked in shifts, often barely sleeping, driven by the understanding that failure was not just a professional setback, it could mean disaster on the battlefield. To assist in breaking Enigma, the British had already developed electromechanical machines known as bombs. These devices could test possible configurations at speeds far beyond human capability. But Lorenz was on a different level. The bombs were simply not enough. The challenge demanded something faster, something more adaptable, something that could handle the sheer volume and complexity of Lorenz encryption. That's when the idea emerged. Instead of relying solely on human analysis or mechanical assistance, what if they built a fully electronic machine? One that could process data at unprecedented speeds, using vacuum tubes to perform logical operations almost instantly. It sounded revolutionary. It also sounded impossible. Many experts at the time believed that machines using large numbers of vacuum tubes would be unreliable. Tubes burned out frequently. The more you used, the higher the chance of failure. Building a machine with thousands of them seemed like a guaranteed disaster, especially under wartime conditions, where consistency was everything. But Tommy Flowers saw things differently. Drawing on his experience in telecommunications, he believed that vacuum tubes could be reliable if they were kept running continuously and designed properly. He proposed building a machine that would not just assist code breakers, but effectively transform the entire process. It would automate the analysis of Lorenz messages, testing patterns at a speed no human or mechanical system could match. His proposal was bold, too bold in the eyes of many. Some at Bletchley Park were skeptical. The idea of committing valuable resources to an unproven technology in the middle of a war seemed risky, even reckless. There were doubts about whether it could be built in time, whether it would work at all, and whether it could be maintained under constant use. But the situation left little room for caution. The Allies needed a breakthrough, and they needed it fast. So Flowers took a leap of faith. Working largely outside the traditional structures at Bletchley Park, he began developing his design. The machine would rely on thousands of vacuum tubes, reading encrypted data from paper tape at incredible speeds, analyzing patterns in real time. It would be unlike anything ever constructed. This wasn't just engineering. It was a gamble against time, resources, and the limits of technology itself. As construction began, the urgency only intensified. Every delay meant more encrypted messages slipping through, more decisions being made in the dark. The codebreakers continued their manual efforts, pushing themselves to exhaustion, but they all understood the same truth. Without a new approach, Lorenz might remain unbroken. And if that happened, the Allies would face one of the most critical moments of the war without the intelligence they desperately needed. Yet even as doubts lingered, something remarkable was taking shape behind the scenes. Wires, circuits, and glowing vacuum tubes began to form a machine that few fully understood, but many hoped would change everything. The tension was almost unbearable. Because if this machine failed, it wouldn't just be a technical setback. It would mean that the most secure communications of the Nazi High Command would remain hidden, untouched, unread, and dangerously powerful. But if it succeeded, it could open a direct window into the mind of the enemy, and for the first time in the war, the Allies might finally gain the upper hand where it mattered most.
What began as a bold idea was now turning into a physical reality, one that would push the limits of technology far beyond anything that had existed before. Deep within secure facilities linked to Bletchley Park, engineers and technicians worked relentlessly to bring Colossus to life. At the center of it all was Tommy Flowers, quietly overseeing a project that many still believed was too ambitious to succeed. His vision was simple in concept, but extraordinary in execution. A fully electronic machine capable of processing encrypted data at speeds no human or mechanical device could ever match. To understand just how radical this was, it helps to consider the state of technology at the time. Most machines were mechanical or electromechanical, limited by moving parts, friction, and wear. They could only go so fast before they broke down. But Flowers was proposing something entirely different, using thousands of vacuum tubes to perform calculations electronically, almost instantaneously. In total, Colossus would use around 2,400 vacuum tubes. At the time, that number was staggering. Vacuum tubes were known to be fragile. They generated heat, consumed power, and had a reputation for failing unpredictably. Building a machine with just a few hundred tubes was already considered risky. Building one with thousands? Many experts thought it was doomed from the start. But Flowers had a crucial insight. Instead of turning the machine on and off, which caused stress and increased the likelihood of failure, he designed Colossus to run continuously. By keeping the tubes warm and stable, he dramatically reduced breakdowns. It was a simple idea, but one that went against conventional wisdom, and it worked. As the machine took shape, its scale became impossible to ignore. Tall racks filled with circuits and wiring lined the room. Rows of glowing tubes cast a constant, almost otherworldly light. The air hummed with electrical energy. This wasn't just a tool. It felt like something entirely new, something that didn't quite belong to its time. Colossus didn't look like a modern computer. There were no screens, no keyboards, no stored programs in the way we understand them today. Instead, it operated using paper tape, long strips of punched holes representing encrypted data. These tapes were fed through the machine at incredible speeds, sometimes thousands of characters per second. As the tape moved, Colossus analyzed the data in real time. It performed logical operations, comparisons, pattern checks, probability calculations, searching for the hidden structure within the Lorenz Cipher. What would take a human team days or weeks to process, Colossus could do in hours. This was the true breakthrough. For the first time in history, a machine was not just assisting human thought, it was accelerating it in a way that fundamentally changed what was possible. Problems that once seemed unsolvable were now within reach. Still, there were risks. Even with Flowers' innovations, no one could be completely sure the machine would hold up under continuous operation. If it failed during critical moments, it could delay the entire code-breaking effort. And time, as always, was the one resource they could not afford to lose. The first full version of Colossus was completed in late 1943 and became operational soon after. All eyes were on the results. When the machine was switched on and the first tapes began to run, there was a sense of anticipation mixed with uncertainty. Would it actually work? Could this massive experimental system deliver on its promise? The answer came quickly. Colossus didn't just work, it exceeded expectations. It processed encrypted Lorenz messages at speeds that transformed the entire workflow at Bletchley Park. Codebreakers who had once been overwhelmed by the complexity of the cipher now had a powerful ally. The machine didn't replace them, but it amplified their abilities to a degree no one had imagined possible. Patterns that were once invisible began to emerge.
Structures hidden within the encrypted streams became clearer, and slowly, methodically, the Lorenz cipher began to give way. What made Colossus truly remarkable was not just its speed, but its reliability. Despite initial fears, the machine ran for long periods without failure. The very technology many had doubted became the foundation of its success. It proved something profound. Large-scale electronic computing was not only possible, it was practical. This realization extended far beyond the immediate needs of the war. Though few could see it at the time, Colossus represented the beginning of a new era. The principles behind its design would eventually influence the development of modern computers, shaping the digital world in ways that would only become clear decades later. But in that moment, its purpose was singular: break Lorenz, unlock the messages, reveal the intentions of the German High Command. As more Colossus machines were built and deployed, the process became faster, more refined, more powerful. Each successful decryption brought the Allies closer to understanding their enemy at the highest level. And yet, outside those secure rooms, the world remained unaware. The existence of Colossus was one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war. Even many who benefited from its intelligence had no idea how that information was obtained. It was a silent force, operating in the background, shaping decisions without ever being seen. Inside Bletchley Park, however, there was no illusion about its importance. They knew they were witnessing something extraordinary, not just a machine, but a turning point. Because for the first time, intelligence was no longer limited by human speed alone. The boundaries had shifted. The impossible had become achievable. And as Colossus continued to run, relentless, precise, and ahead of its time, it brought the Allies closer than ever to breaking the most secure cipher of the war.
By early 1944, something extraordinary had begun to happen inside the quiet, heavily guarded buildings of Bletchley Park. What had once seemed impossible was now becoming routine. Encrypted Lorenz messages, once an impenetrable wall of noise, were starting to reveal their secrets. At the center of this transformation was Colossus. With its relentless speed and precision, the machine had fundamentally changed the pace of intelligence gathering. Messages that previously took weeks of manual effort could now be analyzed in a matter of hours. The difference was not just technical, it was strategic. For the first time, the Allies were no longer reacting to German decisions after the fact. They were beginning to understand them as they were being made. Each successful decryption offered a glimpse into the thinking of the German High Command. Orders, assessments, concerns, expectations, these were no longer hidden. They were being read, studied, and quietly integrated into Allied planning. And the Germans had no idea. They continued to trust the Lorenz system completely, sending their most sensitive communications across the airwaves without hesitation. From their perspective, nothing had changed. Their cipher remained unbreakable. But behind the scenes, everything had changed. As more Colossus machines came online, the flow of intelligence increased. Teams at Bletchley Park worked around the clock, feeding intercepted signals into the system, refining methods, and extracting meaning from the decoded data. What they uncovered was not just useful, it was transformative. One of the most critical moments came in the lead-up to the Allied invasion of Western Europe. The operation, later known as D-Day, required absolute precision. Thousands of ships, aircraft, and troops would move in coordination across the English Channel. The margin for error was almost non-existent. If the Germans anticipated the invasion correctly and concentrated their forces in the right place, the entire operation could fail. The Allies needed to know what the German command believed. And through Lorenz decrypts, they did. Messages revealed confusion within the German ranks. There were disagreements about where the invasion would occur. Some believed it would happen at Pas-de-Calais. Others were less certain.
Crucially, key commanders were slow to react, uncertain whether the Normandy landings were the main attack or a diversion. This hesitation was everything, because in war, time is often the deciding factor. Hours, even minutes, can determine whether defenses hold or collapse. The intelligence provided by Colossus allowed Allied planners to confirm that their deception strategies were working. The Germans were looking in the wrong direction, preparing for an attack that wasn't coming. It gave the Allies confidence. Not blind confidence, but informed confidence, based on direct insight into the enemy's thinking. And when the invasion began, that advantage proved decisive. But D-Day was only one example. Lorenz decrypts provided a continuous stream of high-level intelligence throughout the final stages of the war. They revealed troop movements, supply issues, command decisions, and strategic concerns. They exposed weaknesses, delays, and miscommunications within the German system. For Allied commanders, it was like having access to the enemy's internal conversations. Imagine planning a move in a game of chess while knowing exactly how your opponent intends to respond. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to anticipate their strategy and adjust your own in real time. That was the kind of edge Colossus provided. And yet, it had to remain invisible. The secrecy surrounding this capability was absolute. If the Germans ever suspected that Lorenz had been compromised, they would change their encryption methods immediately. The advantage would vanish overnight. So the intelligence had to be used carefully. Not every decrypted message could be acted upon directly. Sometimes commanders had to ignore valuable information or find alternative ways to justify their decisions, anything to avoid revealing the true source. It was a delicate balance, using the intelligence effectively while protecting the secret behind it. Still, the impact was undeniable. As the war progressed, the cumulative effect of this intelligence began to shift the balance more and more in favor of the Allies. German operations became increasingly predictable, their strategic flexibility diminished, their ability to surprise was reduced, and all the while, they continued to speak freely through a system they believed was secure. Inside Bletchley Park, the people working with Colossus understood the magnitude of what they were doing. They saw the messages, they saw the patterns, they saw the results. But they also understood something else. They could never talk about it. Not during the war, not after it. The existence of Colossus, the success of Lorenz decryption, the role it played in shaping critical operations, none of it could be revealed. Officially, it didn't exist. The victories it enabled would be attributed to other factors, other decisions, other visible efforts. The machine that helped unlock Hitler's secrets would remain in the shadows. But its influence was real. Every decoded message, every insight gained, every decision informed by that intelligence brought the Allies one step closer to victory. It shortened the war, it saved lives, and it demonstrated in the clearest possible way the power of combining human ingenuity with technological innovation. Colossus was no longer just an experiment. It was a weapon, a silent one, hidden behind walls and wires, but as powerful as any force on the battlefield. And as it continued to run day and night, message after message, it ensured that the Allies were no longer fighting in the dark. As the war in Europe drew to a close in 1945, the machines that had helped unlock some of the most guarded secrets of Nazi Germany continued to run quietly inside Bletchley Park. Colossus had done exactly what it was built to do. It had turned the impossible into the routine. It had helped expose the inner workings of the German High Command, and in doing so, it had played a role in shaping the outcome of the war. But as victory approached, a different kind of decision had to be made. What do you do with a machine that powerful when its very existence is a secret? The answer, at the time, was simple and extreme. They erased it. After the war, most of the Colossus machines were dismantled, their components were broken down, their designs classified, their documentation hidden away under strict government secrecy. The people who had worked on them were sworn to silence, bound by laws that prevented them from speaking about what they had achieved. For decades, they said nothing. The world moved on, celebrating visible victories, honoring soldiers and generals, telling stories of battles fought across land, sea, and air. But the silent war, the one fought with logic, circuits, and encrypted messages, remained buried. Colossus, the machine that had helped crack one of the most secure ciphers of the war, effectively disappeared from history. And because of that, something remarkable happened. When the first modern computers began to emerge in the late 1940s and 1950s, they were often described as entirely new inventions. The idea of large-scale electronic computing seemed revolutionary, unprecedented. Few people realized that years earlier, under the pressure of global conflict, a machine had already demonstrated exactly what was possible. Colossus had been there first. Its use of vacuum tubes, high-speed data processing, and programmable logic placed it far ahead of its time. It wasn't a general-purpose computer in the way we think of today, but it proved a critical concept, that electronic machines could solve complex problems reliably and at scale. That idea would go on to change the world. As decades passed and secrecy restrictions were gradually lifted, fragments of the story began to surface. Historians, engineers, and former codebreakers started to piece together what had really happened inside Bletchley Park. What they uncovered was not just a wartime success story, it was the foundation of an entire technological era. Colossus wasn't just a code-breaking machine, it was a glimpse into the future. Its principles, speed, automation, and electronic logic would eventually shape everything from early mainframe computers to modern cybersecurity systems. The same idea that drove its creation, the need to process and understand vast amounts of information quickly, remains at the heart of today's digital world. In many ways, the challenges faced during the Lorenz project still exist. How do you secure communication against interception? How do you detect hidden patterns in complex data? How do you make decisions faster than your opponent? These questions didn't disappear with the end of World War II, they evolved. And the solutions continue to build on the foundations laid by machines like Colossus. Today, we live in a world defined by information. Data moves across the globe in milliseconds. Encryption protects everything from personal messages to national security systems. And behind it all are technologies that in one form or another trace their origins back to those early experiments in electronic computing. Yet for all its influence, Colossus remains relatively unknown compared to other wartime innovations. Perhaps because it was hidden for so long. Perhaps because it didn't leave behind dramatic images of battle or destruction, or perhaps because its greatest achievements were invisible, lines of code broken, messages revealed, decisions influenced in silence. But its legacy is undeniable. It showed that innovation doesn't always come from ideal conditions. Sometimes it emerges under pressure, when the stakes are highest, when failure is not an option, and when the only way forward is to attempt what has never been done before. Inside Bletchley Park, a group of individuals faced a problem that seemed unsolvable. They didn't accept that limitation. Instead, they redefined what was possible. They built something new, something powerful, something that would outlive the war itself. And although the machine was dismantled and its story hidden for years, its impact could not be erased. It lives on in every computer, every secure communication system, every piece of technology designed to process information at speed. Colossus did more than break a cipher. It changed the way humans solve problems. It proved that with enough creativity, determination, and technical skill, even the most complex challenges can be overcome. And in doing so, it quietly helped shape the modern world, long before anyone realized what had truly been achieved.